bucka. Ha. You know the deal.
The next thing we're going to talk about with integers is adding integers. And as discussed in the previous video, ever since you start to learn how to work with numbers, you do learn to work with integers. It's just typically at the beginning, you're only dealing with positive integers. So if we take an example of a question like 2 plus 3, well, that's an addition question that does involve integers. It's just, it only involves positive integers. And as discussed in the last video, if we don't have a sign in front of the number, we can assume it's a positive. Now, we could put a sign in front of each of these numbers, so we could say it's positive 2 plus positive 3. That's the same as 2 plus 3. To make things a little bit less confusing, sometimes we'll put brackets around the actual integers to separate it from the operation. So this is our addition sign here, whereas these indicate that these values are positive. So if we're going to use a number line to answer this question, usually what we would do is we would start at the first number. So we would start at 2, and if we're adding 3, that means we're moving to the right 3 places. So if we're adding positive 3, we're moving to the right 3 places, and so positive 2 plus positive 3 is positive 5, or just 5. So as we saw with the previous example, if we're going to use a number line to answer an addition question, we're always going to start at the first number. So same idea here, we are going to start at positive 2. This time though, we're adding negative 3. Now when we added positive 3, we moved to the right 3 places. Negative 3 is actually the opposite of positive 3. So when we add a negative, we're actually going to move the opposite direction. So in this case, we're going to move to the left 3 places. So when we start at positive 2 and move to the left 3 places by adding negative 3, we end up at negative 1. So once again, you can see here that using a number line is a very powerful tool when you're adding integers, especially at the beginning when you're first practicing understanding how adding integers works. And when we add integers, we always start at the first number. If we add a positive, we move to the right however many places the second number tells us. If we're adding a negative, we move to the left however many places the number tells us. So here's another example where we're adding 2 integers. Again, with this one, we're going to start at the first number. So we're going to start at negative 5. We're adding a positive, in this case positive 4. So since we're adding a positive, we're going to move to the right. And since we're adding positive 4, we're going to move to the right 4 places. And if we start at negative 5 and move to the right 4 places, we end up at negative 1. So here's an example where we're actually adding 3 integers. Just with as with the previous examples, though, we're always going to start at the first number. So we're going to start at negative 3. We're then told to add negative 2, which means we need to move to the left 2 places. So negative 3 plus negative 2 is negative 5. But now we need to add positive 5. So from there, we're going to move to the right 5 places. When we're adding a negative, we move to the left. When we're adding a positive, we move to the right. And if we move to the right 5 places from negative 5, we end up at 0. So the next thing we're going to talk about, now that we've talked about adding integers, and the next thing we're going to talk about is subtracting integers. And once again, ever since you learned how to subtract, you have been subtracting integers. It's just typically they've always been only positive integers. So when we have a subtraction question like 8 minus 3, Since we don't have a sign in front of those numbers, remember that if we don't have a sign in front of a number, to the left of a number, we assume it's a positive. So another way to write this question is positive 8 minus positive 3. Now, if we're going to use a number line for the subtraction question, we know we're going to start at the first number again. And if we're subtracting 3, that means we move to the left 3 places. So we know that 8 minus 3 is 5, or positive 5. So when we're subtracting a positive, we move to the left. Now, we could create a set of rules for subtracting integers, but what often ends up happening is people get confused between adding and subtracting. We know that if we subtract a positive, we move to the left that many places. But if you recall from adding, if we wanted to move to the left on a number line, another way to do that is adding a negative. So subtracting positive 3 is the same as adding negative 3. These two questions are exactly the same question. They're equivalent. Both of these end up with the same result. Subtracting positive 3 means we move to the left 3 places. And as we just talked about with adding negative 3 means we move to the left 3 places. So again, we start at the first number. If we're adding a negative, we move to the left that many places. So once again, we would end up at positive 5. So because we have this property here where when we change from subtraction to addition, as long as we change the sign of the second number to its opposite, we end up with the same result. We actually have an option of never having to subtract integers. So one way to deal with subtracting integers is to never subtract integers. So here's another example, and once again we're subtracting positive 3. If we're subtracting positive 3, we know we're moving to the left 3 places on the number line. So the first thing we're going to want to do with this is rewrite this question as an addition question. So we're going to actually change this question so that instead of subtracting, we're going to add. And as we saw with the previous example, when we do that, the first number stays the same. We don't do anything with the first number because on the number line we always start with the first number. Well, we're going to change subtracting to adding. But adding is not the same as subtracting. So if we're going to change from subtracting to adding, something else has to change. We know that when we subtract positive 3, we move to the left 3 places on a number line. Well, that would be the same as adding negative 3. So these two questions are exactly the same question. They're written in different ways, but they're exactly the same. We've changed the operations to their opposite, and we've changed the second number to its opposite. So now if we look at the second question, we know we're going to start at negative 5, and we're going to move to the left 3 places. So we end up at negative 8. Which means the answer to the first question is negative 8, because it's exactly the same question. So here's another example where we're subtracting 2 integers, and once again, one way to deal with subtracting integers is to simply not subtract integers. So rather than subtract, we're going to add. We're going to change the subtraction question to an addition question. When we do that, as we've seen now a couple of times, the first number always stays the same, because on the number line we always start at the first number no matter what. We're going to change subtraction to addition, but to keep this question the same, we have to change the second number to its opposite. So the opposite of negative 5 is positive 5. So now if we use our rules for addition, well, that means that we're going to start at negative 1. We're always starting at the first number. Since we're adding positive 5, we're going to move to the right 5 places. And that means we end up at positive 4. So the answer to -1 plus +5 is +4, which means the answer to -1 minus -5 is +4, because these two questions are exactly the same question. Subtracting a negative is the same as adding a positive. Subtracting a positive is the same as adding a negative. So just a quick review of what we've talked about here. Initially we started talking about adding integers together. And as we saw, using a number line is a powerful tool when we're first learning how to add integers. When using a number line to add integers, you always start at the first number. If you're adding a positive, move to the right that many spaces. If you're adding a negative, you move to the left that many spaces. When subtracting integers, one way to deal with that is you can change the subtraction question to an addition question, but then you also have to change the number after the addition to its opposite. And then you just follow the rule for adding. So to finish off our lesson on adding and subtracting integers, I'm going to ask you to answer a few questions here. So question number 1 is all just adding integers. So again, if you're going to use a number line to do that, you start at the first number. If you're adding a positive, you move to the right that many places. If you're adding a negative, you move to the left that many places. For question number 2, we're subtracting integers. And once again, one way to deal with that is to change the question. So for each of those questions in question number 2, you're going to have to change them to an addition question first. But remember, you have to change the sign of the second number to its opposite, and then follow your rules for adding. And then question number 3 asks, what is the answer, what is the result you always get whenever you add two opposite integers? And just as an addition to that, I would ask, is the same true if you subtract two opposite integers? If you're able to answer all of those questions, congratulations, you now have a firm understanding of how to add and subtract integers.